Hey there, welcome to Sleepy History Secrets, the channel where history gets strange but the voice stays calm. Tonight, we're wandering back into the Middle Ages, an era that believed the universe was perfectly logical, right up until you tried to live in it. Our story tonight is about rules, not the kind that make sense, but the kind that somehow worked anyway. Because once the Roman Empire collapsed, everyone was left standing in the ruins with no police, no clocks, no plumbing, and apparently no plan. So naturally, the solution was simple. Write more rules. Hundreds of them. Rules about when to wake up, what to wear, how to pray, when to eat, who to marry, and precisely when to stop existing. And somehow, it all held together. Before we drift too far into the past, take a quiet moment to like the video or subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy falling asleep to humanity's bad decisions. And if you'd like, leave a comment telling us where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's oddly comforting to know how many of us are awake at the wrong hour, each in our own little corner of history. Now, get comfortable. Maybe let a soft fan hum in the background. The world we're about to visit is one built on bells, superstition, and the fragile hope that if you followed every rule perfectly, maybe life would stay in one piece. Let's begin. In a place without clocks. Imagine waking up and realizing time doesn't belong to you. There are no watches, no ticking sounds, no gentle glow from a bedside screen. The only rhythm that exists is the church bell. It rings to tell you when to rise, when to work, when to pray, when to stop, and sometimes when to panic. You live your entire life inside its echo. That's medieval timekeeping. Precision through repetition, order through noise. In this world, rules are the closest thing to comfort. After Rome fell, Europe was less a continent and more a badly managed group project. Villages sprouted where cities had died. Roads vanished under weeds. The only thing people still trusted was paperwork, even if it was written by a monk who hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. Every scrap of parchment promised control. And so, rule by rule, Europe rebuilt itself from chaos. Some of these new laws made sense. Others were ambitious. You couldn't wear certain fabrics if you weren't rich enough. You couldn't hunt if you didn't own land. You couldn't eat meat on Fridays or speak too loudly near a monastery. And if you accidentally broke one of these rules, well, congratulations. You had just become a teaching moment. The first of these rulebooks appeared not in castles, but in churches. Priests realized that a terrified population needed something stable, even if it was illogical. So they began to regulate everything: how to wash, how to pray, how to sneeze without offending God. The penitential tariffs, long lists of sins with price tags attached, became Europe's favorite self-help guide. Steal a chicken, 3 days of fasting, tell a lie, a week of prayer, murder someone. That's expensive, some told, but redeemable. In theory, anyone could buy back their soul. In practice, the system mostly improved the church's revenue. You can almost admire the efficiency. With no police and no bureaucracy, the church ran Europe's first moral accounting office. Each soul was a spreadsheet, each sin a miscalculated entry, and somewhere behind the walls of a monastery, a tired monk was balancing the ledgers of humanity, one confession at a time. Still, for the average villager, rules were survival. If you didn't know when to light your fire, you risked burning down the whole street. If you didn't know what to eat, you might break a fast and end up an accidental heretic. If you didn't show proper respect to a lord, you might discover gravity the hard way. So people obeyed. They covered their hair, they covered their mouths, and after sunset, they covered their fires. because the bell said so. In this strange, rule-bound world, even clothing became moral philosophy. The sumptuary laws dictated what colours you could wear based on your social rank. Silk was for nobles, wool for merchants, coarse linen for everyone else. You could literally spot sin by fabric. A peasant wearing velvet was as suspicious as a priest in sequins. Tailors became informants. Inspectors carried measuring tapes. Looking good was practically a misdemeanor. But beneath the absurdity, there was a quiet logic. Rules built walls between classes so no one had to guess who they were. They told you what to wear, eat, and say. And in doing so, they told you who you were allowed to be. For a fragile society terrified of chaos, that was everything. The air of a medieval village smelled like a combination of smoke, yeast, and moral anxiety. Every sound, from the hammering of a blacksmith to the bell of vespers, was a reminder. Order or oblivion. The smallest infraction could unravel the illusion of peace. And perhaps that's why people clung to rules so tightly. Because if they stopped pretending the world made sense, they might have to admit it didn't. In the soft haze of candlelight, a family would kneel by their hearth before sleep, muttering prayers that sounded less like devotion and more like negotiation. If they followed every law, perhaps tomorrow would arrive in one piece. It usually did, but not always, because even the best rules can't stop fire, famine, or fate. Still, people tried, and in trying, they made order out of fear. As we drift further into the story, we'll see just how deeply those bells and scrolls ruled life. From the bedtime curfews that kept towns from burning to the sacred diets that saved both souls and livestock. For now, though, it's enough to imagine yourself standing in that narrow street, the bell ringing in the distance, smoke curling from 1,000 small fires, and everyone around you whispering the same silent hope that following the rules might be enough. You end your day not when you feel tired, but when the bell decides you should. Its echo floats through the cold air like an order disguised as a lullaby. At the first ring, shops shutter. At the second, fires shrink. At the third, the village exhales. The sound marks not peace, but obedience, the kind born of fear and survival. This is the curfew, one of the oldest and strangest rules of medieval life, a law to go to bed. The phrase itself came from French, couvre-feu, cover the fire. It wasn't poetic, it was literal. People were told to cover their hearths before sleeping, to smother flames under ash, to seal warmth inside and danger out. Most homes were built from wood, straw, and optimism, a bad combination for open fire. A single spark could erase a neighbourhood before anyone managed to finish saying, "Saint Benedict, help us." And because medieval firefighting consisted mostly of prayer and buckets, prevention was the only plan. So the bell rang, and everyone complied. The night in a medieval town was not peaceful. It was suspiciously quiet. Fires burned low, doors barred, dogs muzzled. Travel after dark was forbidden unless you carried a lantern and an excellent excuse. Anyone wandering without one risked being mistaken for a thief or a fool, which in those days were often treated the same. Night watchmen patrolled the streets, armed with staves and exhaustion. Their job was to enforce the curfew and remind people that bedtime was not optional. There was a strange comfort in that shared surrender. When the last bell faded, the town became a single organism, breathing in unison. Everyone sleeping, or pretending to. The baker dreaming of dough, the scribe of ink, the blacksmith of not burning alive. In a world where every day could collapse into chaos, uniform sleep was civilization itself. And yet, behind the calm surface, you can imagine the small rebellions. Someone whispering by the dying fire, a late drinker sneaking from the tavern, two lovers meeting under a sky that didn't care about curfews. Every generation finds a way to disobey bedtime. Some things never change. The logic of the rule, however, went beyond fire. Darkness was dangerous in every sense. Crime flourished when eyes could not see. Wolves prowled at the edge of villages. Demons, at least according to local theology, were more punctual after sunset. And so curfew became not only safety policy, but spiritual strategy. Sleep early and sin less. A tidy equation. Morality through exhaustion. For most people, the law wasn't cruel. It was routine, just another rhythm in a world built entirely on rhythms. The bell that marked the start of work also marked the end of it. The same sound that woke you also told you when to rest. It was time itself, concentrated into metal. When it rang, you didn't check your watch, you checked your conscience. Inside the house, the scene was a performance repeated for centuries. Someone banks the fire with ash. Someone slides the wooden bar across the door. Children huddle under wool blankets, the air heavy with smoke and straw. The night smells of wood and sweat and quiet faith. Outside, frost creeps along the walls, indifferent to human routines. The stars glitter above, cold, ancient, and slightly amused. There were exceptions, of course. Monks had their own schedule, far less humane. While villagers slept, monasteries awoke to chant the matins, prayers held in the middle of the night. Their bells rang too, echoing across the valleys, dividing time into holy fragments. Imagine hearing that distant sound while half asleep, realizing someone, somewhere, was already negotiating with eternity while you were still trying to keep your toes warm. The curfew bell carried both comfort and control. It reminded people they were part of something larger, a kingdom, a faith, a system that promised safety if only you obeyed. And if you didn't, well, there were fines for that. Disobeying the curfew could mean punishment, especially in cities where trade, gossip, and gambling tended to outlast daylight. It was the medieval version of staying online too late. Everyone did it. Everyone was technically guilty, and everyone blamed the moonlight. The strange thing is that it worked. Fire accidents declined. Night, crime dropped. Even disease spread slower, since people were less likely to wander between homes after dark. It was an entire public health policy hidden inside a bedtime story. Centuries later, the phrase "cover the fire" would evolve into our modern word, curfew. The rule survived long after the reason faded, and maybe that's what's quietly beautiful about it. The way fear turned into ritual, and ritual into habit, until no one questioned why the bell rang anymore. It simply did, because it always had. Order, even when illogical, feels safer than freedom when the world outside is cold and full of wolves. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it, that faint, metallic hum from another century. It's the sound of 1,000 small hearths being smothered in ash, of doors closing, of faith pretending to be certainty. Somewhere in that echo, you might hear your own bedtime routine, checking the locks, dimming the light, convincing yourself the night is under control. History never leaves, it just changes shape. And so, as we follow the thread a little further, we'll find that not every law was meant to frighten. Some were meant to feed. The next time the bell rings, it won't be to send you to bed, but to remind you it's time to eat. In a world where hunger and faith were the same language, even food had its commandments. You would think that eating should be the simplest part of life. You feel hungry, you eat, you stop. But in the Middle Ages, it wasn't so easy. Food was not just fuel, it was faith made edible. Every bite carried moral weight, and every meal was a test of obedience disguised as dinner. Because in a world constantly flirting with famine, the church did what any responsible institution would do. It turned hunger into theology. There were rules for when to eat, what to eat, and when to feel guilty about both. The calendar was a patchwork of fasts and feasts, over 180 days a year when meat was banned, and a handful of others when you were allowed to celebrate by eating as much as you could afford. The logic was beautifully circular. You starved to prove devotion, and then you overate to prove gratitude. Balance, of a sort. On paper, these rules were about saving your soul. In practice, they also saved the livestock. When winter came, cows and sheep were too precious to kill. If everyone stopped eating meat at the same time, herds survived longer, milk lasted, and fisheries flourished. The fasts kept the population alive, even if it didn't feel particularly holy at the time. Religion became a public health policy with extra steps. The most famous of these fasts was Lent, a 40-day food audit that tested both patience and creativity. No meat, no eggs, no dairy, but fish, mercifully, was fair game. Which is why, by the 12th century, Europeans were essentially swimming in salted cod. Monasteries built ponds to breed carp and eels, and merchants turned oceans into supply chains of sanctity. The church said, "Abstain," and capitalism quietly replied, "Of course, would you like that in barrels or bundles?" There's a certain humour in the loopholes. Beavers, for instance, were declared acceptable to eat on fasting days because, according to clerical reasoning, they lived in water and thus counted as fish. Otters, too, occasionally slipped through theological cracks. Somewhere, a monk with a straight face wrote that God would surely understand. Faith may have been eternal, but definitions were negotiable. For ordinary people, the rules demanded creativity. Peasants mixed lentils with barley, onions with hope, and called it stew. Bread was dark, dense, and full of grit. Not by choice, but by the generosity of the grinding stones that leaked sand into the flour. It made every meal a moral and dental trial, but still, they gave thanks. You didn't question the church's menu unless you were eager to test how far mercy stretched. The rhythm of fasting and feasting shaped the year. Villages became synchronized eating machines, their diets rising and falling with the bell. During fasts, silence fell across markets, as butchers closed and fishermen grew smug. During feasts, everything reversed. Music, laughter, and the sweet smell of roasting meat rolled down narrow streets like grace itself. It was order disguised as celebration, a system that kept chaos and hunger in balance. To modern ears, the idea of a spiritual diet plan sounds absurd. But in an age when plagues could erase towns and crops failed without warning, obedience was survival. Fasting made food last. Discipline kept neighbours from fighting over scraps, and the church, ever practical beneath its robes, wrapped necessity in holiness so that no one had to admit they were simply rationing. Inside monasteries, mealtime was its own ceremony. The bell rang, the monks lined up, and the reader began reciting scripture as they ate. No one spoke, mouths full of silence and thin soup. Every swallow was an act of humility. To speak while eating was to let pride in through your teeth, and if you happened to enjoy the taste, that was between you and your confessor. Yet for all the strictness, there was warmth in the communal hunger. It bound people together, the way shared suffering always does. When everyone is equally hungry, envy takes a nap. The poorest could sit beside the pious, and for one small meal, feel equally disciplined. The rule erased class. if only temporarily, and replaced appetite with solidarity. Faith has always known how to use discomfort to make people equal. Still, the temptation lingered. The smell of forbidden meat carried like a rumor through narrow streets. It drifted from noble kitchens where rules bent under gold. The poor learned quickly. Holiness smells like onions. Sin smells like lamb. You could tell who had influence by the aroma that followed them. If envy had a scent, it was roast. Of course, even rules, built for good intentions, have a way of mutating. Over time, fasting became competitive. Saints outdid one another in self-denial. Some claimed to live only on bread, others only on prayer. One holy woman was said to survive for years on nothing but the Eucharist and stubbornness. The church celebrated her as a miracle. Doctors might have called it a crisis. But miracles always sound better in Latin. And so, day after day, bell after bell, Europe prayed and chewed and prayed again. Faith, hunger and survival became one seamless loop. People believed that obedience could save them from famine and hell alike. And sometimes it did. Because these strange rules, for all their absurdity, worked. They kept herds alive, kept fisheries thriving, and gave meaning to hunger. A starving body became a spiritual investment, and everyone hoped for divine interest rates. If we follow the thread a little further, we'll see that not every rule was about the body. Some guarded the land itself, forests, rivers, and the animals inside them. If food was sacred, then so was the hunt. But as you'll soon hear, even catching a rabbit could become an act of rebellion. For now, though, imagine the faint smell of fish and fasting bread, the soft toll of the evening bell, and the quiet murmur of gratitude rising with the smoke. In that strange harmony of hunger and faith, you can almost taste the logic of survival. You enter the forest quietly, the way someone enters a church. The air feels heavy, not with holiness, but with risk. Branches hang low, damp with mist, and the earth smells of wet leaves and secrets. You know what you're about to do is illegal. You also know it's necessary. That's the strange thing about medieval law. Sometimes survival was the crime. In most of Europe, the forest didn't belong to the people who lived near them. They belonged to kings, nobles, bishops, and anyone wealthy enough to own a horse. Every deer, boar, and rabbit was royal property, even if they were currently standing in your vegetable patch. To hunt without permission was not just theft, it was treason. And if caught, you could lose more than your dinner. In some places, the punishment was a fine you could never pay. In others, it was a hanging tree that didn't care about your excuses. The rule began as protection, a way to conserve animals for winter, to stop entire populations from vanishing. But over time, it turned into theatre. The king hunted for sport. The peasant hunted for survival. The first was noble tradition, the second, a felony. The logic was simple and cruel. If everyone could hunt, what would be left for the powerful to show off? In a society built on hierarchy, even hunger had to respect the chain of command. And so the forest became a paradox, life everywhere, but forbidden to touch. The poor gathered firewood, mushrooms, or berries at their own risk, glancing over their shoulders for wardens on horseback. The rustle of leaves could be wind or warning. It's said that peasants learned to move as silently as shadows, blending into the trees until they were almost part of them. The forest taught patience, stealth, and a very quiet kind of courage. Still, there were moments of rebellion. A single arrow loosed in the wrong direction could feed a family for a week. A snare set under moonlight could turn despair into dinner. There was danger in every twig that snapped, every hound's bark carried through the fog. But hunger makes strange companions of fear and hope. Many took the risk, whispering a prayer that God might forgive what the law never would. And the stories spread of outlaws who turned the forest into a kingdom of their own. Robin Hood may have been legend, but he was built from truth. Dozens of nameless men who decided that fairness didn't always wait for permission. They became symbols of something deeper, the longing for justice inside injustice. It's comforting to think that even in a world obsessed with obedience, someone dared to say no. Quietly, carefully, and usually at night. The nobles, of course, saw things differently. To them, the forest was a private garden, a living gallery where power could strut in boots and feathers. Hunting was ceremony, hounds, horns, velvet gloves, and politics disguised as leisure. A successful hunt wasn't just about catching an animal. It was about being seen catching one. And the best trophies weren't antlers or pelts, but admiration. The forest became another stage where hierarchy performed itself. Everyone knew their role. The lord hunted, the servant followed, the peasant stayed out. There's a dry humour in how precise the laws became. Royal foresters kept detailed records of how many rabbits could be legally caught each season, even though peasants weren't allowed near them anyway. Some regions had entire offices devoted to the inventory of deer, as if nature itself could be audited. Paperwork and power always get along. The Middle Ages proved that bureaucracy can thrive anywhere, even in the woods. Yet beneath the absurdity, the rule had logic. The forests really were fragile. Too much hunting could collapse the ecosystem, driving away animals and eroding soil. The nobles, without realizing it, were accidental conservationists. Their selfishness protected the land, but only as long as it served their banquets. For everyone else, preservation felt a lot like punishment. Sometimes the punishments themselves were almost ritual. A poacher might be forced to walk through town with the carcass tied around his neck, the smell of shame following him. Others had their traps broken, their bows burned, their names whispered like cautionary tales. The law didn't just punish, it performed. Each sentence reminded the village that mercy was expensive and justice was rarely edible. But not all forests obeyed. On the fringes of kingdoms, far from castles and clerks, there were still pockets of wilderness where the rules grew thin. Villagers built hidden trails, traded secret signals, and shared what they hunted in silence. They called it necessity. The law called it rebellion. Both were right. If you stand in one of those forests now, if you close your eyes and breathe in the damp air, you might still feel that quiet defiance. The centuries have changed the trees, but not the feeling of trespass. The same wind that once carried the smell of risk still moves between the branches. It's the scent of survival pretending to be sin. And maybe that's what all these strange medieval laws were about. Finding a way to survive without admitting how fragile life really was. If everything had a rule, then maybe nothing could fall apart. If God owned the fish and the king owned the forest, then perhaps someone somewhere was in control. It was a comforting illusion, and humanity clings to those best at night. From here, the story opens into another kind of rule, one not about animals but about justice itself. Because once the forest was forbidden, the courtroom became sacred, and in that strange space between faith and fear, even innocence had to be proven through pain. The next time someone lit a fire or reached for a weapon, they weren't fighting for food. They were fighting for proof that God was watching. There is a certain comfort in believing that someone else will sort out right and wrong for you. In the Middle Ages, that someone was God. The courts might have worn robes and carried scrolls, but the final judgment was divine outsourcing. If truth was uncertain, they simply asked heaven to weigh in with boiling water, red-hot iron, or a convenient drowning test. This was justice by ordeal, where faith met physics, and physics usually won. Imagine standing in a crowded square. The air smells of smoke, sweat, and baked bread from the stalls nearby. A judge in fur robes reads from a scroll while the accused, a farmer perhaps or a widow, stands barefoot on the cobblestones. No lawyers, no jury. Just the promise that if your soul is pure, God will intervene before the pain does. It's a remarkably efficient system. All you need is heat, water, and collective denial. The ordeal of boiling water was simple enough to be terrifying. A cauldron bubbled in the center of the square, guarded by priests. You would reach in and pull out a small object, usually a ring or a stone, from the bottom. Your hand was then wrapped in linen and sealed for 3 days. If, when unwrapped, your skin looked miraculously unburned, you were innocent. If not, well, at least the evidence was visible. God's will was both the verdict and the treatment plan. The ordeal of the hot iron followed a similar logic. Carry a glowing bar across a short distance without screaming, fainting, or catching fire. Those who managed were proclaimed righteous. Those who didn't were guilty, or more accurately, human. Somehow, this process satisfied both crowd and clergy. Justice had been seen, and pain had been properly distributed. The miracle was not that people believed it, but that they needed to. Water had its own variety of honesty test. Suspected witches and heretics were tied and lowered into rivers or ponds. If you sank, the water accepted your innocence. If you floated, you were guilty of rejecting purity and, unfortunately, had to be executed. It was an uncomfortably perfect paradox. No one survived innocence for long. The church later tried to discourage this particular method, calling it superstition, but by then it had already travelled well beyond theology and deep into habit. The strange part is that ordeal trials didn't come from cruelty. They came from confusion. Most villages had no detectives, no evidence, and no forensics. When something went wrong, a theft, a crop failure, a sudden death, someone had to be blamed. Accusation was easier than investigation, and when every mystery was divine punishment, only divine proof would do. So people watched, believed, and whispered prayers that they'd never be chosen to demonstrate justice in person. For all its absurdity, there was order in the ordeal. It gave frightened communities a way to function, a ritual that restored peace after chaos. If God's hand decided, then no one else was responsible. The logic was twisted but comforting. Faith carried the burden of proof, and pain carried the receipt. It's hard not to see a kind of exhausted wisdom in that, the same kind that makes people today still believe in systems they know don't quite work because the alternative is silence. Not all ordeals involved suffering. There was also the ordeal of oath, a quieter trial in which the accused swore innocence before witnesses. If enough people vouched for your honesty, you walked free. This was less theology, more social pressure, holiness by popularity. A person's reputation became their evidence, and the court relied on gossip to function. It's comforting to realize that medieval justice was, at times, one long community rumor with ceremonial pauses. Some priests tried to improve things. They blessed the water to ensure fairness, measured the heat of the iron to standardize pain, and introduced waiting periods for divine review. it didn't help much. The success rate for miracles remained inconsistent. Still, the effort to make suffering procedural is somehow touching. Bureaucracy's first attempt at compassion. By the 13th century, even the church began to feel uneasy. Too many faithful hands came back burned. Too many innocents sank. In 1215, the Pope officially banned ordeal trials, suggesting maybe God had other things to do. Secular courts began replacing divine tests with evidence, testimony, and the charming innovation of doubt. Human reason was late to the party, but it did eventually arrive. And yet, the idea lingered. Long after the ordeals ended, villages kept the stories alive. They were retold by firelight as warnings and entertainment. Parents whispered them to children who broke rules: behave, or you'll face the boiling pot. Fear has always been a powerful teacher. Even after the theology faded, the ritual lived on in memory, reshaped into folk tales and ghost stories. You might wonder how people stood in that square, watching someone's hand vanish into boiling water, and felt calm. The truth is, they didn't. They were terrified. But they needed to believe the world was fair. If pain could reveal truth, then maybe their own suffering meant something too. That's the hidden comfort of cruelty, the illusion that it serves a purpose. If you close your eyes now, you might still hear it. The hiss of iron, the murmur of prayers, the crowd's collective breath. It's unsettling, yes, but also strangely hypnotic, a kind of moral lullaby sung in the key of fear. In those moments, Europe dreamed of justice, even as it burned itself trying to find it. From here, our quiet exploration turns to a gentler kind of rule, one that replaced punishment with rest. Because after all that fire and guilt, humanity needed a break. The next law on the list wasn't about pain or fear, it was about mercy. A single day when the world had to stop working by divine decree. A rule that demanded, quite literally, to do nothing. You might think that one day of rest would come as a gift. But in the Middle Ages, even peace had a schedule. The Church decided that one day each week should be holy, not merely quiet, not leisurely, but absolutely obediently idle. It was called the Sabbath, and it was less a suggestion than a law, because if people weren't forced to stop working, they probably never would. After 6 days of endless motion, ploughing, grinding, hammering, fetching, carrying, sweating, Sunday arrived like a sigh. The bells rang differently that morning. They didn't command or warn, they invited. You could tell the difference in the tone, softer, longer, almost gentle. The village responded like a machine easing into silence. The markets closed, the fields rested. Even the blacksmith's fire dimmed, replaced by incense smoke rising from the church door. It's easy to imagine the relief, though it came with rules of its own. You couldn't labour, travel, trade, or even cook too elaborately. The Sabbath was about restraint, a social invention that pretended to be divine mercy. In theory, it was a day to feed the soul. In practice, it was a test of how long you could sit still without sinning. For a population addicted to survival, rest felt suspicious. The Church taught that the seventh day mirrored God's own pause after creation. If the Almighty could rest, so could you. But people needed convincing. Some worked secretly, hiding their tools behind hay bales or pretending to tidy the barn. Others simply redefined what counted as work. Medieval lawyers, yes, they existed, once debated whether walking to another field to talk about work technically counted as labour. It did. Apparently, holiness included loophole management. Still, the Sabbath had its quiet beauty. Imagine the sound of a whole village asleep but awake. No hammering, no shouting, no clanging of pots, only the low chant of morning prayer drifting across rooftops, the soft creak of wooden pews, the shuffle of boots on stone floors. For a brief moment, the noise of survival gave way to stillness. The air smelled of wax and bread. Even the animals seemed to understand. Horses stood quietly, chickens wandered without supervision, and cows looked profoundly contemplative. Everyone had permission to exist without purpose. Children, of course, were less enthusiastic. They were expected to behave as miniature saints. No playing, no yelling, no fun. A quiet child was a holy one, or at least a safe one. Parents kept them in line with a mix of hymns and threats about demons hiding behind the hedges. And so, for one day a week, childhood became a monastic experiment. It's comforting to know that boredom has been considered virtuous for a very long time. But the Sabbath wasn't only about holiness, it was practical economics. Fields left unploughed didn't exhaust their soil. Artisans who stopped for a day wasted fewer materials. The rhythm of rest extended the rhythm of survival. Even the poorest benefited. If everyone stopped together, no one lost business. The rule leveled the exhaustion just enough to keep the world turning. For priests, the Sabbath was also a strategic reminder. It kept people close, to the church, to confession, to obedience. One weekly reset where everyone remembered who ran the calendar. Attendance was watched closely. Miss too many Sundays, and questions would be asked. Were you ill, working in secret, or worse, doubting? Faith was not only about believing, it was about being seen believing. And yet, not all who came to pray did so willingly. Some nodded off during sermons that stretched into eternity. Others counted the cracks in the walls, waiting for the final hymn. There's a record from a small English parish where the priest complained that half his congregation snored through the homily. He took it as a sign of spiritual indifference. I prefer to think it was the earliest form of religious relaxation therapy. By afternoon, the mood softened. Families gathered for simple meals, bread, ale, maybe a piece of fish left over from the fast. Neighbours exchanged polite gossip disguised as moral reflection. Even the sun seemed slower, sliding gently toward evening as though reluctant to end the quiet. And for once, people had time to notice small things. The sound of wind in the thatch, the way smoke curled in the sky, the fact that the world hadn't collapsed during their single day of idleness. Still, discipline lingered. At sunset, when the last bell of the Sabbath echoed, normal life returned instantly. Fires roared back to life. Hammers resumed their songs. The brief dream of rest dissolved into the steady grind of necessity. But something in the silence stayed. Even when the week began again, the memory of peace lingered like the aftertaste of bread. Maybe that was the true intention all along. Not perfection, not holiness, just a structured reminder that life could be more than toil. It's strange that humans have to be ordered to rest, yet maybe that's the only way they'll ever do it. The Sabbath wasn't a luxury, it was survival disguised as worship. And for a society obsessed with rules, it was perhaps the gentlest one ever written. As our path now carries us further into the story, the bells will ring again. But this time, not for prayer or silence. They'll ring for trade, ambition, and craft. Because the next great invention of medieval order wasn't a saint or a law. It was the guild, a system that turned labour itself into faith and work into its own kind of devotion. When you think of the Middle Ages, you probably picture knights, castles, and the occasional plague. But most people lived and died under a far more powerful institution, the guild. Not a church, not a kingdom, but something in between. A family of workers bound by rules, pride, and the faint smell of yeast. Guilds were the social glue of towns, and their laws made sure no one made bread or boots without permission from the right people. In theory, a guild was simple. It protected its craft, trained its apprentices, and ensured fair prices. In practice, it was a polite monopoly. A shoemaker could not become a baker, and a baker could not touch a hammer. Every trade had its own patron saint, secret handshake, and price list approved by the town council. If you wanted to open a shop, you needed approval, membership dues, and a small miracle. Economy met theology, and the result was bureaucracy with a soul. Every guild had ranks: apprentice, journeyman, and master. It sounded like a noble ladder, but it was mostly a slow march uphill, carrying flour or iron. Apprentices were children, often as young as 10, sent away from home to live in the master's house. They learned not only the craft, but also obedience, humility, and how to survive on leftover stew. Years passed before they were allowed to touch the good tools. Mistakes were punished, sometimes with lectures, sometimes with flying objects. But apprenticeship had its small joys: meals by the fire, stolen moments of laughter, and the quiet hope of one day earning your own shop sign. Once trained, the apprentice became a journeyman. Literally, a man who journeyed. He travelled from town to town, offering his skills for a few coins and a meal. It was a way to see the world through the smell of sawdust and soup. Journeymen shared stories in taverns about distant markets and stingy masters. They compared techniques and, occasionally, complained about the same universal truth: work was still work, no matter how poetic the craft looked in frescoes. But travel had a magic of its own. Every city had its accent of labour. Cologne smelled like leather, Venice like fish glue, Paris like ambition. To become a master was another matter entirely. It required proof of skill, a masterpiece. This was not metaphorical. It was literal. A baker's masterpiece might be a perfectly risen loaf, a goldsmith's, a delicate ring, a stonemason's, a carved angel that didn't fall apart in the rain. The guild inspected it with the solemnity of priests judging a miracle. If approved, you became a master. If not, you started over. The irony is that many of these masterpieces were never kept or displayed. They were simply tests. Beauty sacrificed to regulation. The system created stability, but it also ensured that innovation arrived late and slightly nervous. Still, guilds offered protection in a harsh world. If a member fell ill or died, the guild helped his family. If a fire destroyed a workshop, others contributed tools and labour to rebuild it. There were feasts, processions, and holidays when every member marched proudly behind their banner. The Tailors' Guild wore fine cloaks, the Carpenters' Guild carried hammers like sceptres, and the bakers, of course, handed out bread to prove their civic worth. In those moments, a guild was not just an economic body, but a small, living kingdom of dignity. Of course, every rule has its irony. The assize of bread and ale, one of the earliest recorded economic regulations, set fixed prices for basic food. If grain prices rose, bakers were ordered to make smaller loaves rather than charge more. If they cheated, if the bread weighed too little or was baked too dark, the punishment was public. Offending bakers were sometimes tied to a cart and paraded through town with their underweight loaves hanging from their necks. It was both humiliation and advertising. You might not buy their bread, but you definitely remember it. For all its control, The guild system kept chaos at bay. It guaranteed consistent quality, fair trade, and a sense of belonging in a world that changed slowly, if at all. People trusted a guild sign more than a royal decree. The baker's mark on a crust meant safety. It meant no one had watered the dough or swapped good grain for bad. In an age before brands, guilds were the original seal of trust. But comfort always comes with limits. The same rules that preserved order also smothered invention. A blacksmith who tried to create a new design might face fines for disturbing tradition. A brewer who experimented with herbs risked being accused of witchcraft. Progress moved forward, but carefully, like a monk sneaking wine into Lent. The guilds built cathedrals, carved statues, and invented miracles of engineering, just not too quickly. After all, perfection took time, and they had plenty of that. Inside the workshops, the sounds were steady and comforting. The scrape of wood, the hiss of dough meeting heat, the ring of metal against metal. The air was full of purpose. Even exhaustion felt meaningful when wrapped in routine. Every hammer strike was a heartbeat of civilization. In a way, the guilds were the silent keepers of Europe's sanity. One careful stitch, one measured loaf, one polished stone at a time. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The faint rhythm of labor echoing through the streets, mingling with the distant toll of the church bell. The smell of bread cooling on wooden racks drifts through open windows, mixing with the scent of sawdust and iron. It is the perfume of order, the fragrance of control, and under it all lies a single thought. If everything has its rule, maybe everything will hold together. As we drift further into the story, that smell of bread will change into something sharper. The smoke of candles, the perfume of incense, the weight of time measured not in coins but in bells. Because the next rule was not about bread or gold, but about hours, and how sound itself became the measure of obedience. If you were born in the Middle Ages, you would never ask what time it was. You would already know, not because of clocks or watches, but because the air itself told you. Time wasn't measured in numbers. It was announced in metal. The bell tower was your calendar, your alarm, your reminder, and sometimes your warning. It was the closest thing the medieval world had to an operating system, and everyone lived inside its sound. The first bell of the day rang before dawn. It told the baker to rise, the monk to pray, and the farmer to check if his field had survived the night. A few hours later came the second, time to begin labour. Then a third for midday rest, another for evening prayer, and a final one before curfew. Each note carried both rhythm and command. There was no need to argue or negotiate. The bell had already decided. It wasn't merely noise, it was language. A different pattern for birth, for death, for fire, for war. A long, low toll meant danger. A bright, quick sequence meant a wedding. If you lived near a church, you could tell the whole day's news just by listening. The bells didn't just keep time, they narrated it. They also owned your sleep. The monks, who managed these sonic schedules, followed the divine hours, 8 periods of prayer that divided the day into equal portions of holiness and exhaustion. At midnight, they woke for matins. At dawn, lauds. Then came prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, and finally compline, the prayer before bed. The rhythm was relentless, but there was a strange comfort in it. Each prayer blurred into the next, each bell into another. Time became less a line and more a circle, eternal repetition disguised as devotion. For ordinary people, the bell meant both dependence and safety. It told you when to work when to stop, when to worship, when to hide. You didn't need to understand astronomy or count hours on a sundial. The sound itself was the measurement. And because bells were sacred, to ignore them was to risk not just your schedule, but your soul. The church bell was also the most democratic sound of the Middle Ages. Rich and poor alike heard it. It rang over walls, across fields, through fog. Even a beggar sleeping beside a stable could feel its vibration through the ground. For a few seconds, everyone lived in the same moment, no matter how unequal their lives were. It was unity by resonance. If faith was invisible, the bell was its audible proof. But the bells also reminded you of hierarchy. The largest and most beautiful ones hung in cities, funded by noble families and blessed in ceremonies that looked suspiciously like baptisms. They had names: Mary, Gabriel, Hope, Patience. Each was treated like a living being, washed with holy water, anointed with oil, and rung for the first time as if it were speaking to the heavens. A city with a proud bell tower could hear its own importance in every echo. It was prestige turned into vibration. You might imagine the sound was always beautiful, but medieval bells weren't tuned the way modern ones are. They groaned, clanged, and sometimes howled when struck by wind or cold. Yet people found the imperfections comforting. It was a sound that reminded them the world was still working, noisy, uneven, but alive. The bell was the heartbeat of civilization, slightly irregular but steady enough to trust. Even commerce danced to its rhythm. Markets opened with one bell and closed with another. Shopkeepers used it to time their sales. Taverns used it to start drinking hours, which, if we're being honest, were most of them. There was no need for appointments, only understanding. Meet me at the third bell after sunrise. Everyone agreed on the schedule because the sound left no room for debate. And when something went wrong, the bell told you that too. A sudden, frantic toll meant fire. A slow one, death. When plague arrived, the bells rang so often that people began to fear the silence between them more than the sound itself. The air seemed to vibrate with mourning, a city singing to itself in grief. Yet even then, the bells gave comfort. They reminded people that order hadn't entirely died. As long as the tower stood, time still had a voice. Sometimes a village might lose its bell to war or theft. A rival town could melt it down for cannon metal or ransom it like a hostage. In such cases, silence was more than absence. It was humiliation. One chronicler described a city that rang empty buckets to pretend it still had its bells. They couldn't bear the sound of nothing. The memory of order mattered more than its reality. It's strange how humans need sound to believe in structure. The ringing of bells, the ticking of clocks, the hum of machines, all tell us the same story, that time is real and someone is in charge of it. But in truth, time never belonged to bells or clocks. It belonged to people listening, waiting, and trusting that the next sound meant another day had safely begun. If you stand in an old European town at dawn, you can still hear it, faint, layered, echoing through narrow streets. A bell that once ruled life still whispers across centuries. Its song feels less like command now, more like memory. And maybe that's fitting. The world no longer lives by bells, but it still remembers what obedience sounded like. As our quiet exploration turns forward, that same sound will lead us towards something stranger, a rule that blurred the line between morality and hygiene. Because when people stopped listening to the bells, they started fearing water, and soon the act of washing itself would become suspicious. The next story begins with steam, sin, and the closing of bathhouse doors. There was a time when taking a bath was a public event, a social gathering with buckets, laughter, and far too much steam. In the early Middle Ages, most towns had bathhouses, warm rooms filled with chatter, music, and occasionally questionable decisions. People bathed together, families and strangers alike, wrapped in the comfort of water and gossip. Cleanliness wasn't just practical, it was joyful. It made people feel civilized, until civilization decided to get nervous about pleasure. As the centuries rolled on, water began to feel suspicious. Bathhouses became the subject of rumors, sermons, and eventually laws. The same steam that once symbolized purity now smelled faintly of sin. Moral reformers warned that bathing tempted the flesh and weakened the soul. Doctors, who were not much better informed, claimed that warm water opened the pores to disease. It was an odd alliance, faith and medicine shaking hands over shared paranoia. The logic was almost beautiful in its circularity. Plague often followed periods of warmth and crowding. Bathhouses were warm and crowded. Therefore, bathhouses must cause plague. Correlation became commandment. And so, one by one, cities began closing their public baths, replacing them with sermons about modesty and hygiene by prayer. It's strange how quickly humanity can turn comfort into guilt. A century earlier, hot water had been an act of health and hospitality. Now it was indulgence, the kind of sin that smelled faintly of lavender soap. Church leaders preached that true purity came from within, not from scrubbing. The faithful listened, and the result was a population both holy and profoundly sticky. Not everyone agreed. Monasteries kept their own rituals of washing. Cold water, strict timing, never for pleasure. The idea was to cleanse the body only as much as necessary to protect the soul from distraction. A monk once wrote that too much washing invites vanity. You can almost hear the sigh of resignation behind those words. There's always been a fine line between discipline and discomfort. Meanwhile, outside the cloisters, ordinary people simply adapted. They replaced soap with linen. Instead of bathing, they changed their underclothes occasionally. Linen, it was believed, pulled dirt from the skin. In theory, it worked. In practice, it turned laundry into a new form of purification ritual. Washing the cloth became a stand-in for washing yourself. It's possible medieval people invented dry cleaning just without the cleaning part. The rich had options, of course. They kept private tubs in their homes, carved from wood or even metal, and filled with water scented by herbs or rose petals. These private baths were safer from both plague and gossip, but they were still shadowed by superstition. There are letters from noblewomen apologizing for bathing too often, as if confessing an embarrassing secret. Cleanliness had become something to hide, a luxury carried out in silence. The poor, meanwhile, made do with what they had. They bathed in rivers during summer, shivered through winter, and relied on smoke, wind, and resignation to manage the rest. When visitors complained about the smell of peasant villages, locals would shrug and say, "The air is honest." In its own way, it was. The smell of sweat, ash, and soil was proof that life went on, rules or not. The irony, of course, is that avoiding baths made people sicker, not safer. Dirt clung to skin, fleas clung to dirt, and plague clung to fleas. By the time anyone noticed the pattern, faith had already replaced reason as the town's water filter. Physicians prescribed prayer, perfumed oils, and occasionally carrying flowers near your nose to purify the breath. If that didn't work, there was always hope, or the next funeral. Still, bathing, never disappeared entirely. In secret, people continued to fill buckets, heat stones, and pour water over themselves in quiet defiance. They didn't call it luxury anymore. They called it necessity. In that hidden steam, there was a kind of rebellion, small, private, and fragrant. Each drop of water was an act of resistance against fear. There's something deeply human in that contradiction. We create rules to protect ourselves, then slowly realize the rules are what hurt us. But by then, they've become tradition, and tradition is harder to wash off than any layer of dirt. So we keep following them, out of habit, out of pride, out of the quiet terror that maybe our ancestors knew something we don't. If you close your eyes now, you can almost hear it. The hiss of water on stone, the sigh of a body lowering into warmth, the faint laughter echoing through wooden walls. Then the sound fades, replaced by silence, and the scratch of a quill writing a decree to close the doors forever. The steam vanishes, and with it the idea that cleanliness and innocence could coexist. By the late 14th century, Europe had perfected the art of smelling. Like penance, perfume became armor, incense, deodorant, and moral superiority, the new cologne. When people met, they didn't shake hands. They politely ignored each other's fragrance of survival. History tends to romanticize the Middle Ages, but this is one detail you can be grateful to leave in the past. Yet even this strange fear had logic hiding beneath it. Bathhouses were communal, and community, in times of plague, was a luxury no one could afford. Isolation saved lives, even if the reasoning was wrong. In their own misguided way, those who banned bathing did what they always did best, turn disaster into ritual. They gave disease a moral explanation, because that was the only kind of explanation that comforted them. And so, the water cooled, the tubs emptied, and the echoes of laughter were replaced by sermons about purity. The law had done its work. The world became quieter, duller, a little dirtier, but oddly peaceful. Because when no one is clean, no one stands out. And sometimes, sameness feels safer than salvation. As we follow the thread a little further, we'll find that the obsession with order didn't stop at the bathhouse door. It followed people to their tables, into their kitchens, and even into the colour of their bread. Because in a world where smell had turned suspicious, taste was next in line. And soon, eating itself would become a declaration of who you were allowed to be. In the Middle Ages, bread wasn't just food. It was identity, economy, and theology baked into one crust. It told the world who you were, your wealth, your class, your place in the great human hierarchy of crumbs. Every loaf carried a quiet message, and most of those messages said the same thing: stay where you belong. The colour of your bread was your social rank in edible form. The rich ate white loaves made from finely sifted wheat, smooth as pride, and twice as expensive. The poor ate dark, heavy bread made from barley, oats, or whatever grain hadn't been stolen by weather or taxes. Sometimes the dough contained more stone dust than flour. Each bite filed your teeth like a slow confession. And yet, you ate with gratitude, because there was always someone hungrier. It wasn't always meant to be cruel. The difference in bread came from the difference in mills. Finely ground flour required more labour, more sieving, more time, luxuries of patience the poor could not afford. So when noblemen looked down at their spotless loaves and saw purity, they were mostly admiring economics. Still, the illusion stuck. White bread became the taste of superiority. Dark bread, the flavour of endurance. The laws agreed. By the 13th century, many towns enforced strict bread regulations known as the assize of bread and ale. It dictated not only how bread was baked, but exactly how much it should weigh, depending on the price of grain. A loaf too small or too light was considered theft. A baker caught cheating might find himself tied to a cart, his underweight loaves hanging from his neck like an edible accusation. Humiliation was a powerful seasoning. There was reason behind the rigidity. In a society one bad harvest away from hunger, bread riots were common. The law tried to calm the masses with predictability. Better to control the baker than face a mob. And so, cities began to measure morality in ounces. A good baker wasn't just honest. He was a stabilizer of civilization. A bad one could start a war with a handful of flour. Yet, for all this order, bread was personal. It shaped every life from birth to death. Children cut their teeth on it, priests broke it in ceremonies, and the dead were sent to rest with crumbs tucked beside them, a snack for eternity. If there was one object that united medieval Europe, it was the loaf. It was everywhere, every day, so ordinary it became invisible, and like most invisible things, it ruled everything. Inside the kitchens of the poor, bread dough was a family ritual. Women rose before dawn to grind the grain, mix it with water, and bake it in communal ovens shared by neighbours. The air filled with the scent of yeast and smoke, a smell that was both humble and holy. When the bread came out hard or uneven, no one complained. It was fuel, not art. Each loaf represented a small victory against time and hunger. For the rich, bread came gilded, wheat flour whitened with milk, brushed with egg, baked in ovens lined with tile. It wasn't food, it was status disguised as lunch. At banquets, servants carried golden trays of loaves shaped like crowns, doves, or hearts. Guests tore the bread slowly, pretending reverence while thinking about dessert. Ironically, their perfect white bread was less nutritious than the peasant's dark one. But privilege, like pastry, has always been more about appearance than nourishment. The church also had its say. During Mass, bread was transformed into the body of Christ, the most sacred meal of all. For believers, this act gave bread a second life, not just survival, but salvation. The same dough that fed your stomach could now feed your soul. It was a comforting symmetry, the divine hidden inside the daily. And so, bread became the hinge between heaven and hunger. Yet scarcity haunted every crumb. In bad years, when the grain failed, people stretched flour with bark, acorns, or powdered beans. The loaves turned grey, bitter, and desperate. Chronicles describe families eating bread so coarse it cut their mouths. Still, they baked. To make bread, even bad bread, was to believe the world might continue. Every loaf was a small prayer that the next one would be better. It's easy to laugh at the idea of laws about bread, but imagine a world where it is the centre of everything, the line between life and death, fairness and famine. A loaf was democracy before democracy had a name. Everyone, rich or poor, shared the same need for it, even if they couldn't share the same loaf. Bread was the closest thing to equality people had, and that might be why it needed so many rules. You can picture it now. A baker's shop at dawn, the sound of dough slapping against wood, the faint dust of flour drifting through sunlight, a child waiting with a coin warmed by a small hand. The smell of crust fills the street, sharp, alive, ancient. It's the smell of civilization itself, still rising, still imperfect, but holding together. From here, our quiet path begins to darken again, because when you have eaten your share and the day is done, the world still has to face what cannot be avoided: sickness, death, and the laws that tried to control even those. The next sound in our journey is not the ring of a bell, but the knock of nails on wood, the sound of quarantine and silence. When disease came knocking, the rules became brutal and survival meant isolation. For now, though, you can rest in the warmth of that small bakery, listening to the steady breath of the fire and knowing that even absurd laws once kept the world fed. The story begins, as many do, with someone being told to leave. Eric the Red was not the kind of man who blended into a crowd. He was large, loud, and allergic to compromise, qualities that, in 10th century Iceland, got you exiled faster than you could pack a ship. He'd already been thrown out of Norway for some killings, a phrase that historians still repeat with admirable vagueness. In Iceland, he did it again. When the local council grew tired of apologies and funerals, they gave him a familiar sentence, 3 years away from everything he knew. In short, a mandatory vacation with no return ticket. But Eric was not a man to waste good banishment. He looked west, where rumour spoke of land beyond the fog, a place first spotted by sailors who promptly decided it was too depressing to settle. Eric disagreed. He loaded his ship with supplies, livestock, and optimism, 3 things that rarely fit well together, and set out into the grey Atlantic. You can imagine the scene, the creak of oars, the slap of waves, the taste of salt thick enough to chew. Behind him lay every burned bridge. Ahead, nothing but cold possibility. After weeks of sailing through mist and stubborn hope, he saw it, a coastline of black cliffs and white silence. The place was vast, barren, and entirely unpromising. But Eric, ever the marketer, saw potential. He called it Greenland, because, he explained later, people will come if it has a pleasant name. It was the first recorded act of false advertising in European history, a masterpiece of optimism bordering on fraud, and astonishingly, it worked. When Eric returned to Iceland at the end of his exile, he began recruiting settlers. He told stories of fertile meadows, rivers full of fish, and valleys gentle enough for cows to nap in. He left out the icebergs. He didn't mention the storms that could turn ships into splinters, or the months when the sun barely bothered to rise. Greenland, he promised, was paradise waiting for the brave. And if the brave didn't exist yet, they could at least be gullible. In 985, a fleet of 25 ships left Iceland carrying families, animals, tools, and dreams wrapped in wool. Only 14 made it. The rest vanished into the fog, leaving behind nothing but stories. Those who arrived stepped onto a world that looked like it had only recently been invented. No trees, little soil, endless silence. It wasn't green, but it was theirs now, and there's comfort in ownership, even of a frozen mistake. They built their homes from what they had: turf, stone, driftwood, and determination. Each wall was a compromise between architecture and survival. Inside, the air grew thick with smoke and sweat, but it was warmer than the wind outside. They learned quickly that cooperation was more important than pride. The cold punished arrogance faster than any judge ever could. In Greenland, sharing was not kindness, it was law. To refuse a neighbour warmth was to sign both your death sentences. Eric thrived, at least for a while. He built a homestead called Brattalied, planted pastures for sheep, and declared himself chief. His hair, by then a legend of its own, matched the fires that burned through the long polar nights. Visitors said he was generous, fearless, and slightly mad, which was, in fairness, the job description for survival. He had brought civilization to the edge of the map, and civilization politely tried not to notice how close to the edge it really was. But even heroes grow old, and exile leaves a shadow. When a priest arrived years later, sent by missionaries from Norway, Eric's wife, Theodhild, embraced the new faith immediately. She wanted a chapel built beside their home. Eric resisted. He said the old gods had served them well enough. Besides, he argued, they had more pressing issues, like running out of wood, food, and patience. Theodhild, being practical, built the chapel anyway. It's still there, or what's left of it. A small stone ruin surrounded by grass that isn't really green. Looking back, it's hard not to admire the absurdity. A man exiled for violence becomes the founder of a peaceful colony. A frozen wasteland becomes a land of hope through clever branding. And a people who barely survived the trip still managed to invent rules, marriages, taxes, and quarrels. The human urge to organize doesn't freeze easily. For a few decades, it worked. Cattle grazed. Trade ships arrived from Iceland and Norway with timber and iron. Children were born who had never seen trees and didn't miss them. In the summer, wildflowers bloomed between the rocks, giving just enough colour to justify the name Greenland. Life, like moss, found a way to grow where it shouldn't. You can almost hear it now. The crackle of fire in a turf house, the creak of frozen leather, the soft whistle of wind through the cracks. Outside, the sea groans against the ice. Inside, a small group of settlers whisper prayers to both Thor and Christ, just in case. Faith, like warmth, is easier to share than lose. Eric died around the year 1003, after refusing to join his son Leif on a voyage that would accidentally discover North America. Some say he grew ill. Others that he had finally run out of reasons to keep pretending Greenland was green. His story ended where it began, halfway between courage and stubbornness. But the colony he founded endured for centuries more, quietly rewriting the rules of survival. If you stand there today, on that same coast, the wind still sounds the same. It moves over the stones, through the ruins, across the graves of people who believed they could make a home at the edge of the world. And perhaps they did. For a few generations at least, belief was enough. As we drift further into the story, we'll step inside one of those turf houses and see what life looked like when warmth itself became a social contract. The walls will close in, the air will grow thick with smoke and company, and you'll learn the simplest truth the North ever taught. Comfort and cooperation are the same thing. You step inside the house and the first thing you notice is that it breathes. The walls inhale and exhale with the wind, shifting like an animal asleep under snow. It isn't made of stone or wood, but of turf, thick, layered slabs of earth, cut from the frozen ground and stacked like books made of mud. Each block is heavy and damp, packed with grass roots that cling to life even after being turned into walls. If you listen closely, you can almost hear them growing still, quietly rebelling against architecture. This is home. It's warm in a way that feels earned. The outside wind roars like an ocean of teeth, but inside, the air is heavy with breath and peat smoke. You can't see much, just shadows, a few lamps, and faces glowing faintly red from the fire. Every inch of the room smells of wool, milk, and ash. There is comfort in it, though not the clean kind. It's the comfort of survival. Sticky, smoky, close. Greenland settlers didn't build houses to be beautiful. They built them to fight weather. A turf wall 3 feet thick could keep in heat better than any stone. Windows were luxury, so light entered through smoke holes or cracks between beams. In summer, the air stifled. In winter, frost crept in anyway. But even in misery, there was design. Every room had a purpose. The main hall for work and meals, small alcoves for sleeping, a byre attached for the animals. Human breath mixed with cow breath, raising the temperature slightly and the odour dramatically. Comfort through collective suffocation. The hearth in the centre burned peat, slow, steady and forgiving. Wood was too precious to waste, driftwood rarer than gold. The smoke had nowhere to go, so it stayed, curling along the ceiling until everything inside smelled, faintly roasted. Clothes, hair and dreams all carried the same perfume of endurance. When strangers met outside, they recognized each other by scent before sight. Life inside the turf house was not private, it was symphonic. Every movement, every whisper, every sigh carried through the walls. Children learned early to whisper arguments, and couples learned to pretend to sleep. Silence was communal, not personal. You didn't own your solitude here. You borrowed it when others were too tired to notice. Still, in that cramped warmth, families grew close in ways modern comfort rarely allows. Shared space meant shared patience, shared laughter, and occasionally shared fleas. The rhythm of the day was dictated by weather and necessity. Morning began with scraping frost from the door and coaxing the fire back to life. The women churned milk, tended to weaving, and stirred pots thick with barley or dried fish. The men mended tools, repaired roofs, and sometimes just stared into the snow, trying to remember what trees looked like. Children collected ice to melt for water, their hands red with cold but quick with purpose. Even idleness had a function, conserving energy until the next crisis arrived. At night, everyone gathered around the hearth. Stories were traded the way people elsewhere might trade coins. They told sagas of gods, heroes, and unlucky farmers who challenged fate and lost politely. The flicker of fire turned smoke into ghosts. Laughter rose easily. Grief rose slower, but it came all the same. In a place where tomorrow was never guaranteed, storytelling became the only proof that today had happened. Outside, the wind never rested. It pressed against the turf walls like a curious spirit, searching for a way in. Sometimes it succeeded. There were nights when the cold seeped through cracks and whispered across faces like an accusation. You could wrap yourself in furs and still feel the air trying to erase you. But the people here were stubborn. They learned that warmth wasn't just fire, it was company. One body beside another was worth a dozen logs. Sleeping alone was considered foolish, not romantic, not independent, just suicidal. From a distance, the settlements looked like moss-covered mounds scattered along the fjord, barely distinguishable from the land itself. It was as if the people had decided that the only way to survive Greenland was to become part of it. The houses didn't rise above the earth. They sank into it, humble as burrows, resilient as roots. And in those roots, a strange kind of peace grew. The peace of knowing you were exactly as small and temporary as everything else. When traders or priests visited from Norway, they often wrote about the smell. They described it as dense and persistent, which were polite medieval ways of saying unbearable. But they also admitted that the people inside those homes seemed cheerful, strong, and oddly proud of the air they breathed. Perhaps comfort, like truth, depends on what you're used to. The settlers had learned to love their smoke. It hid the cold and softened the faces of strangers until everyone looked the same. Tired, warm, alive. You can picture it now. The orange glow of the hearth, the silhouettes gathered close, the slow hum of wind beyond the walls. The smallest details stand out. The sound of milk bubbling in a pot, the rough texture of wool under your fingers, the way breath fogs in the cold air before vanishing. the entire world reduced to firelight, heartbeat, and survival. It's not a grand story, but it's the one most humans have always lived. Stay warm, stay together, stay hopeful. As we follow the trail a little further, something new begins to rise from the smoke. Faith. Not the kind preached in marble cathedrals, but the kind built from habit and fear. Because when the nights grew too long, even the strongest settlers looked to the sky for meaning. And one woman, tired of waiting for miracles, decided to build her own. Our quiet journey now turns toward her, Theodild, wife of Eric, and the woman who built the first church in Greenland, because salvation, like warmth, required architecture. You wake to the sound of wind praying against the roof. The world outside is pale, endless, and utterly still. Snow has no patience for detail. It smooths everything into one color, one shape, one long silence. Somewhere beyond that white horizon, the sea still moves, but even it sounds tired. Inside, the fire whispers like an apology. The people of Brattaleed rise slowly, pulling on layers of wool and habit. It is another day of survival, another day of rules written by weather. But today, something new is being built. Not another turf wall or cowshed. This time, it's a chapel. Theodild, wife of Eric the Red, has decided that Greenland needs a place to speak to heaven. A modest church of stone and timber, the first of its kind in the New World. It is an act of faith and defiance in equal measure. Because Eric has refused to enter it, he still believes in the old gods, the ones who roar in storms and smile through blood. He thinks the new faith is fragile, too gentle for a land that bites. You can't pray frost away, he says, and no god ever built a roof. But Theodild is not asking permission. She builds anyway, one stone at a time, her breath fogging the air like incense. Perhaps she is less interested in converting her husband than in giving their frozen world a heartbeat. The chapel is small, barely large enough for 10 people. Its roof sags under snow, and its walls lean as if exhausted by devotion. Inside, a single cross stands on a rough-hewn altar, wood carried from the sea, shaped by hands that have never known luxury. A strip of cloth hangs behind it, white faded to grey. When the wind hits the roof just right, it sounds like an organ played by ghosts. And somehow, it is beautiful. Faith here is less about salvation and more about structure. A rhythm for the mind when the body has none left. Every Sunday, a handful of settlers gather inside the chapel, their voices low, their breath visible. They sing hymns they only half remember, in a language that feels foreign even to their tongues. Outside, snow falls through the gaps in the roof, landing softly on their shoulders. No one brushes it off. It feels almost like a blessing. There's an odd intimacy in this kind of worship. No gold, no marble, no incense imported from southern ports, only stone, wool, and the smell of smoke clinging to everything. The people who built this church didn't come to impress God. They came to remind themselves they still existed. Faith, in a place like this, becomes insulation. You wrap it around yourself, thin as cloth, but still enough to keep the cold out of your heart. Theodild herself rarely speaks of belief. She just works, repairs the roof, scrubs the altar, keeps the flame alive. Some nights, she stands at the doorway, looking across the snow to Eric's hall, where laughter and mead rise into the night. He has never stepped inside her chapel, but she doesn't curse him for it. She knows stubbornness is just another form of faith. Faith in oneself, in memory, in whatever gods listen only to silence. So she waits, the way snow waits for spring, without hurry, without hope, but without stopping. When the first priest arrives from Norway, he finds the chapel already alive. He records it in his journal. A holy house built by a woman of strong will, in a land where faith should freeze but does not. He notes that the people here are oddly devout, though they still wear Thor's hammer around their necks, just in case. Syncretism, centuries before anyone thought to give it a name. Faith layered like the turf in their homes, old gods at the base, new ones on top, all holding the roof steady. Eric's refusal to enter the chapel becomes legend. The story spreads. A man so proud he won't bend. A woman so patient she builds a church instead of an argument. Over time, the tale softens. People begin to say he stood outside during the first service, listening through the snow, the sound of singing, muffled but not lost. No one can prove it, but it feels true. Love, after all, has its own kind of religion. You can picture it, the light spilling from the chapel door, flickering across the white ground like a pulse. The people inside humming quietly, not because they believe they'll be heard, but because the act of singing keeps them warm. Somewhere nearby, Eric stares into the dark, pretending not to listen. His breath turns to frost. The wind carries a few notes toward him, and for a brief moment, the entire world sounds alive. In time, the chapel will fall, its roof will rot, its stones will sink, its story will become archaeology. But faith, once built, doesn't really die. It just changes temperature. Every belief begins as architecture, a place to keep the cold out, and ends as memory. Somewhere in that transformation, humanity survives another winter. If you walk there today, you'll find the ruins of Tjodild's church still standing on the hillside above the fjord. No glass, no altar, no roof, only the low walls and the shape of devotion etched into the earth. Snow fills the doorway, wind hums through the stones, and the silence feels almost kind. It's easy to imagine her there, hands red from the cold, looking towards the sea and believing that building anything, no matter how small, was proof that life hadn't given up yet. As we drift further into the story, the warmth begins to fade. Trade routes thin, ships stop arriving, and the colony turns inward. The world grows smaller, colder, and quieter. Soon, even the chapel's bell will stop ringing, and only the ice will answer. Our next step takes us into that silence, to a time when the last ships sailed away, and the Greenlanders learned the hardest law of all, that even survival has an expiration date. By the time the last traders came, Greenland had already learned to live without company. The wind spoke more often than people did, and silence had become a kind of national language. Once, ships from Norway arrived every summer, their sails bright against the grey sea, their holds full of timber, iron and letters from a world that still pretended to remember them. Now the horizon was empty. The ice didn't move anymore. It simply waited. The colony's survival had always depended on one improbable export: walrus ivory. In a global economy powered by vanity, even the edge of the world found its niche. Europe's nobles wanted combs, ornaments, and chess pieces carved from tusks, and Greenland provided them. Each summer, men loaded boats and rowed north into waters littered with icebergs sharp as cathedrals. They hunted among them, hauling walruses onto the floes with ropes and prayers. It was dangerous, filthy work, but it paid, and for a while, it justified the cold. Then came change, as it always does, quietly at first. In the south, traders began importing elephant ivory from Africa. It was smoother, whiter, easier to carve, and it didn't come with frostbite. Suddenly, Greenland's proud hunters were selling yesterday's luxury, The prices collapsed, and with them, the last thread tying the colony to the rest of the world. You could call it the first example of globalization's cold shoulder. Without trade, everything slowed. Iron tools dulled and broke. Wool grew coarser without new dyes or imports. Even the stories people told began to shrink, as if afraid to waste breath. The ships stopped coming, not with ceremony but with absence. No letters, no news, no explanation. Just a widening silence that no one dared call permanent. Winter grew longer. Snow arrived earlier and left later, until the seasons blurred together like ink in melting ice. Cows starved in their stalls. People slaughtered them for food, then learned to live without milk. Bones were ground into tools, shoes, anything that could outlast the body that wore them. The wind found its way through every crack, and the turf houses that once hummed with warmth now whispered like hollow shells. The sound of Greenland had become a slow, patient creak, the noise of things learning to end politely. Still, life persisted in small gestures. People patched sails they would never raise, mended nets for fish that never came, and swept the snow away from doorways that would soon be buried again. Faith survived too, but quieter. The chapel bell rarely rang. There was no one left to hear it. When it did, the sound carried for miles, then vanished into fog. The wind didn't bother returning it. It's easy to romanticize this ending, to imagine noble faces staring bravely into eternity. But the truth was simpler and sadder. They were tired. The rules that had once kept them alive, cooperation, thrift, ritual, had become burdens. There was nothing left to organize. When everything freezes, even obedience stops being useful. All that remained was endurance, stripped of purpose, but still stubbornly beating. Archaeologists would later find the traces. Broken combs, iron nails, a bishop's crozier buried under snow. The objects told the story of a society that never gave up, just slowly forgot why it should. Some graves show people buried in fine clothes, their hair still braided, their hands folded neatly. Even at the edge of extinction, they followed the rules. Civilization died tidily. You can imagine the last family, a handful of figures moving through the white tending animals that no longer exist. The man repairing his roof with frozen hands, the woman baking the final loaf of barley bread, children chasing a gust of snow that looks briefly like smoke. The sea, once a friend, now only stares back with grey indifference. It's not tragedy, it's entropy wearing human clothes. Sometimes you wonder what they thought when the final ship failed to appear. Did they wait another year? 2? 10? Did they still believe in rescue? Perhaps they did. Hope is the last luxury, and it costs nothing to keep. Maybe they told each other that the next summer would be different, that the ice would break, that sails would return, that the world would remember. And in a way, it did. We're remembering them now. There is a kind of poetry in how the colony ended, not with violence, but with quiet. No battles, no rebellions, no last stand. Just people fading back into the landscape that had tolerated them for a while. Their homes turned to mounds, their paths to streams, their churches to ruins. The ice took everything slowly, as if reluctant to disturb the furniture. Even death was polite. Centuries later, when explorers rediscovered the settlements, they found them almost intact. Tools still lay on benches, pots by the hearths, doors half open. It was as though the people had stepped out for a moment and forgotten to return. Inside one house, a broken crucifix leaned against the wall, half buried in dust. Faith interrupted, or maybe fulfilled. After all, what better proof of devotion than refusing to leave the world you believed in? If you stand among those ruins now, the silence feels thick, almost physical. The wind still hums through the same gaps where voices once passed. The sea still presses against the shore, repeating a rhythm older than memory. Somewhere beneath the snow, the bones of the settlers lie curled toward one another, as if sharing warmth even in death. They did not fail. They simply lasted as long as they could. And so the last hearth goes out. The smoke dissolves into air, and the ice closes around it like a soft hand. What remains is the rule that outlasts all others. Everything ends quietly, even civilization, even sound. As the last light fades, the story begins to warm again, faintly, like embers under ash. From here, our quiet journey turns south once more, toward lands still alive with laughter and ritual, where rules weren't about survival, but celebration. Because after ice, humanity always returns to fire, and the next laws to be written won't be carved in frost, but in song. The first warmth that ever returned to the world was probably a wedding fire. After months of cold and silence, people gathered again, not to trade or fight, but to promise. Marriage, in the Middle Ages, wasn't about romance the way songs pretend. It was a contract written in bread and blood, a treaty disguised as tenderness. Two families shook hands, and the result was a lifelong merger between politics and hope. If you look closely at a medieval wedding, you'll see something more diplomatic than sentimental. Each smile hides calculation, each blessing hides a bargain. In an age where alliances could crumble faster than a loaf left too long by the fire, a good marriage was the most efficient form of peacekeeping. Land, livestock, and reputation were the currencies of affection. Love was nice if it happened, but hardly necessary. The elders arranged it all: who would marry whom, how many goats would change ownership, how many silver coins would change hands. A wedding was a council meeting with better catering. You can imagine the scene: two fathers negotiating dowry values, while the bride stared quietly at the floor, counting her new responsibilities instead of her blessings. The exchange wasn't cruel exactly, just practical. When survival depends on cooperation, passion is a luxury item. Still, the ritual carried its own kind of poetry. Before the vows, there were omens to consult. Birds that flew east meant luck. Ones that flew west meant don't. Candles were lit, then carefully observed. If the flame burned steady, marriage would hold. If it sputtered, someone would probably end up sleeping alone in a barn. It's comforting to know humanity has always trusted fire more than intuition. The wedding day began early, with preparation disguised as chaos. Neighbours baked, brewed, and borrowed anything that could be eaten, burned, or worn. The air filled with the smell of roasted meat, smoke, and ale so thick it nearly counted as soup. Musicians tuned instruments that had survived generations of enthusiastic handling. Someone tied flowers to the doorposts, not for beauty, but to keep away spirits who apparently had opinions about other people's marriages. When the ceremony began, it was less about love and more about law. The priest asked the couple if they entered freely, though everyone present knew freedom had very little to do with it. The bride's hand was placed in the groom's, coins exchanged, oaths repeated, and a blessing spoken in Latin that half the audience mistook for weather prediction. Then, at last, came the feast. The true reason anyone showed up. Food was a language everyone understood. Plates of bread, meat, fish, and fruit moved like currency from hand to hand. Ale foamed, laughter echoed, and for one day, rules relaxed. Even enemies were invited. It was considered bad luck to exclude anyone who might later curse you. peace through calories, one of the oldest and most reliable political systems. The bride, meanwhile, became a symbol. Her clothing announced her family's worth, her veil, her modesty, her silence, her wisdom, or at least her compliance. But behind that quiet facade, most women knew exactly what they were doing. Marriage was one of the few tools of influence available to them, and they learned to use it well. A clever wife could run a household, manage trade, arrange further matches, and subtly guide decisions from behind the curtain of expectation. The church might have preached submission, but real life preferred competence. There were moments of genuine joy too, stolen glances, secret laughter, small rebellions that made the formality human. You can picture it. A young couple sneaking a smile while the elders debate goat prices, a brother spilling ale on a noble's shoes, a fiddler trying to remember which tune meant celebration and which meant exorcism. It was messy, noisy, and gloriously alive. For a few hours, even diplomacy felt like delight. And then, as night fell, the tone shifted again. The guests drifted home, or to wherever they could still stand. The priest retired with the satisfaction of having survived another round of theology and shouting. Only the newlyweds remained, surrounded by the echoes of laughter and the faint smell of extinguished candles. Outside, the stars flickered indifferently. Inside, history began again, quietly, awkwardly, sincerely. Marriages were rarely easy, but they worked. Two people became one unit of survival, and from that unit, generations grew. Children learned their parents' negotiations before they learned their prayers. Families intertwined until the entire village resembled one enormous, occasionally argumentative tree. The same faces reappeared at every christening, wedding, and funeral, as if the community had been performing the same play for centuries, only changing costumes. If you step back from the firelight, you can almost feel it. The warmth of bodies gathered close, the low hum of voices blending with the crackle of logs. The scene could belong to any century. Humans haven't changed much in their desire to seal promises beside a flame. The names of gods may shift, but the gestures remain, hands joined, cups raised, hearts cautiously open. There is irony in how much effort went into maintaining peace through such fragile means. A single bad harvest could ruin a dowry. One careless rumor could undo a union. Yet people kept trying, again and again, to find balance through partnership. Perhaps they sensed that survival, like warmth, burns brighter when shared. As we drift further into the story, that warmth grows louder. The music returns, the dancing begins, and the meal turns into ritual. Because marriage might have been diplomacy on parchment, but by nightfall, it transformed into festival. The goats had been counted, the contracts signed. Now it was time for joy to have its hour, even if the hour was long, loud, and slightly out of tune. The morning after the wedding always began the same way, with the sound of goats. Not church bells, not birdsong, goats. They were the real witnesses of medieval love, bleating politely through every negotiation. Because before there could be affection, there had to be accounting. The dowry came first, and romance came somewhere between livestock and linen. Dowries weren't gifts of affection. They were insurance policies written in fur and fabric. When a woman married, her family was expected to provide wealth, not for her comfort, but to prove she was worth investing in. It was the medieval version of a credit score, measured in cows instead of numbers. The richer the dowry, the more stable the alliance. Love might fade, but a goat has a longer shelf life. Of course, this arrangement worked both ways. In some regions, the groom's family offered a bride price instead, a payment for the loss of a daughter's labor. The whole process was surprisingly symmetrical. One family lost a worker, another gained one. Money and animals changed hands, and everyone nodded as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Even priests, who were supposed to represent higher ideals, often paused long enough to make sure the goats had been properly counted. Imagine the scene. Two families gathered in a smoky hall, the air thick with excitement, expectation, and barnyard aroma. On one side, the bride's father listing assets. 3 cows, 2 sheep, 1 spinning wheel, and a carpet slightly used but still valuable. On the other, the groom's relatives pretending to look unimpressed, then whispering hurriedly about whether they could afford more ale to sweeten the deal. Negotiations went on until someone's patience, or someone's goat, ran out. Finally, an agreement was reached. Hands shook, cups clinked, and the union was sealed with a toast that tasted faintly of smoke and relief. There was strategy in every exchange. A family might offer extra animals to secure goodwill, or slip in a hidden clause about inheritance rights. Some even used the occasion to settle old feuds. It wasn't just marriage, it was diplomacy, wrapped in wool. And if the arrangement worked, the families would spend generations reminding each other about how fair the deal had been. The dowry wasn't just wealth, it was the foundation of the new household. The bride brought not only animals and textiles, but tools, utensils, and the invisible labor of experience. She knew how to spin, weave, milk, mend, and measure, skills that no coin could match. In truth, the greatest dowry any woman carried was competence, and that, though rarely written on parchment, was the part her husband depended on most. Among peasants, the exchanges were modest but heartfelt. A blanket woven over many winters, a single cow, a jar of honey from the last harvest. In towns, merchants sent daughters into marriage with bolts of imported silk and boxes of spices worth more than their own houses. In noble halls, the sums became astronomical. Lands, castles, even whole villages traded like wedding gifts. Marriage was not an event, but an economy, with better costumes. And yet, beneath all that trade, something human remained. When the formalities ended, people celebrated together. The dowry animals, now officially symbolic, became part of the feast. Goats bleated outside while their cousins roasted inside. Laughter filled the air. Someone always drank too much. Someone else tried to dance with a jug, and the children collected leftover garlands to crown the dogs. It was messy, noisy, unplanned, the very opposite of the careful negotiations that had preceded it. And maybe that was the point. The feast turned commerce back into community. There were also rituals meant to bless the wealth exchanged. In some villages, newlyweds walked around the fire 3 times, once for prosperity, once for fertility, and once just in case. Grain was sprinkled over their heads, coins tossed into the hearth, milk poured at the doorstep for luck. The logic was simple. The more things you fed, the fewer things might starve you later. In that small, symbolic generosity, the world briefly felt safe. You can smell it now. Smoke, sweat, roasted meat and beer thick enough to chew. The hall flickers with firelight, faces glowing, laughter rolling like the rhythm of drums. In the corner, someone plays a fiddle that has seen too many weddings and too few repairs. Feet stomp, hands clap, and for a moment, everyone believes that life is stable, that rules work, that love can be negotiated after all. Of course, reality returned the next morning. The new couple faced their future armed with goats, pots, and mild exhaustion. The dowry was unpacked, debts recorded, and life resumed its normal pattern of effort and weather. But for a short while, those ordinary objects carried magic. Every bucket, every loaf, every warm animal, a small, bleating promise that survival would continue. There's a quiet sweetness in the practicality of it all. For modern ears, the idea of love measured in livestock sounds unromantic. But to the people who lived it, there was tenderness in that exchange. To share your best cow or your best cloth was to share your future. It wasn't about ownership, it was about trust. And trust, more than love, is what kept the fire burning when the songs faded. As the fire dies down, the guests drift away, and the goats return to their rightful business of staring at everyone with suspicion. The newlyweds step outside into the cool night air. Behind them, the hall glows faintly, smoke curling upward like a prayer that doesn't need translation. Somewhere in the dark, a bell rings once, marking the end of ceremony and the beginning of ordinary life. And in that soft transition, something quietly beautiful happens. The deal becomes devotion. If we follow the glow a little further, we'll find that fire doesn't only belong to feasts and bargains. It also lives in the rituals of blessing, the circle dances, the offerings of bread and honey, the gestures that turn survival into something almost sacred. Because once the dowry was counted and the wine was gone, what remained was a different kind of wealth. Warmth, rhythm, and the strange comfort of moving together in the dark. When the dowry had been counted and the goats stopped judging everyone, it was time for the real ceremony. Not the legal one, but the human one. A marriage was not truly complete until the fire approved. And so the hearth became the stage, the priest stepped aside, and the old gods, the ones people pretended not to believe in, quietly stepped back in. Fire had always been the first witness to human promises. It was older than language, older than law, and far more consistent. You could lie to a neighbor but not to a flame. If the fire refused to catch, the marriage was doomed. If it burned too quickly, someone was too eager. If it smoked, someone had secrets. And if it burned steady and bright, you thanked whatever forces ruled the night for approving of your union. The ritual began at dusk. Two families gathered around the hearth, holding candles lit from a single flame. The couple circled the fire 3 times, stepping carefully over the scattered petals, crumbs, and the occasional shoe that had fallen off in celebration. With each turn, someone recited blessings, part prayer, part superstition, part folk poetry. "May your house be warm," one voice would say. "May your crops rise faster than your tempers," said another. It was half advice, half charm, entirely sincere. Then came the bread, always bread, round, golden, simple. It represented everything a life together required: labor, patience, and a small miracle every morning. The bride and groom broke it in half, dipped the pieces in honey, and shared the first bite as husband and wife. Bread for strength, honey for sweetness. If the honey dripped, it was good luck. Love overflowing, they called it. If it didn't, someone would quietly add more. Better to cheat fate than risk a tasteless future. The smell of the bread mixed with smoke and laughter. Children pressed close, trying to steal crumbs. Old women hummed songs so ancient, no one remembered the words. Someone played a slow tune on a pipe, the notes floating above the fire like moths. It wasn't religion, not exactly, but something older. The instinct to thank the universe, or at least the cook, for another reason to stay alive. Honey, too, had its meaning. It was the memory of sunlight preserved through winter. proof that sweetness could survive the cold. When the couple shared it, they weren't just tasting sugar, they were tasting endurance. Every year afterward, they would remember this moment when life turned bitter, the night when everything began soft and golden. It was the kind of memory that kept people warm long after the fire had burned down to ash. Not all rituals were so gentle. Some regions demanded more dramatic gestures. In parts of Scandinavia, newlyweds jumped over the fire itself, a symbolic test of courage, fertility, and coordination. If both landed safely, they were destined for happiness. If not, well, at least everyone got a story. The air filled with cheers, sparks, and the faint smell of singed hair. The priest usually pretended not to notice. Other customs were quieter. In villages far from any church, couples made their vows under the open sky. A loaf of bread and a cup of ale served as witnesses. The night wind carried their promises across the fields, and somewhere, unseen, someone whispered them back. Even the stars seemed to approve. Steady, distant, pretending they'd seen it all before. It's strange, isn't it, how much meaning humans can bake into a loaf of bread and a spoonful of honey. To outsiders, these rituals might seem simple or quaint, but to the people who lived them, they were survival in symbolic form. Every crumb, every spark, every shared sip of ale said the same thing. We're still here. We still remember how to make warmth out of nothing, and it worked. For one night, everyone forgot about hunger, debt, and the lingering smell of livestock. The hall glowed with firelight and laughter. Children slept on benches, while adults danced in slow circles, shoes scuffing against dirt floors, shadows flickering across walls. Someone shouted an old blessing, "May your fights be short and your winters shorter." It got a laugh, and laughter is its own kind of prayer. You can almost see it now, the low ceiling hung with herbs, the glimmer of honey on bread, the fire burning in steady rhythm with human hearts. A world without music would still have sounded full in that moment. Crackling embers, creaking wood, sighs, the hush of snow outside. Even silence felt like participation. By midnight, the fire had sunk into red coals. Guests began to leave, carrying bits of leftover bread in their pockets for luck. The newlyweds stayed by the hearth. In some places, they were expected to keep the flame alive all night, to prove they could tend a fire together before tending a life. It was a practical test disguised as poetry. Most passed, though not without smoke. In the end, the ritual did what it was meant to. It turned survival into beauty. Fire was no longer just heat, it was promise. Bread was no longer just food, it was continuity. Honey was no longer just sweetness, it was memory. These things grounded the fragile balance of human hope, because even when you can't control the weather or the harvest, you can control what you share. By morning, the first light crept through the smoke hole, pale and silver. Ash settled where the fire had been, and the air smelled faintly of burnt bread and contentment. Outside, frost glittered on the ground, but inside, two people stirred beneath blankets, still half asleep, still holding on to that warmth. For one more day, the fire had won. If we follow the thread a little further, we'll find that these rituals didn't end with the meal. They grew louder, brighter, and far more chaotic. Because when the blessings were done, the dancing began, the circle of celebration where rules dissolved, and even the elders forgot they had bones. The next moment in our quiet journey belongs to rhythm, to the circle dances that turned every promise into motion, and every step into proof that joy, like fire, refuses to stay still. The meal ended, but the night didn't. In fact, the night was only getting started. Because when the bread was gone, and the wine ran thin, and the fire sank into its red, glowing heartbeat, that was when the circle dance began. The feast had been order, the dance was chaos with rhythm, and somehow, both were necessary. There was no orchestra, no stage, no written music. Just a drum, a pipe, a few strings that might have once belonged to a harp or an extremely cooperative animal. The beat was simple, steady, ancient, the sound of time itself tapping its foot. A fiddler struck a note that could have been joy or exhaustion, and everyone understood. Work had been done, debts paid, blessings spoken. Now the body demanded its own prayer. The circle formed naturally, as circles always do. Someone began, usually a cousin too full of ale to remember modesty, and others followed. Hands linked, feet found the rhythm, and the dance unfolded in spirals around the fire. It wasn't graceful in the modern sense. People stumbled, laughed, tripped, recovered, and pretended they had meant to do it all along. It was a dance without perfection, which made it perfect. The movement wasn't just for fun. In old belief, circles had power. They enclosed, protected, bound things together. To dance in a circle around the fire was to seal the evening's vows, to remind the universe that these people, this community, belonged to each other. No matter how hard the next winter might bite, this rhythm would outlast it. Somewhere inside the spinning, laughter turned into something close to prayer. If you had watched from a distance, you might not have known what was happening. All you'd see were shadows flickering across the snow, merging and parting like a single creature. The air thumped with drums and feet. The sound of joy is rarely quiet. It's messy, uncoordinated, and irresistible. Even those who swore they never danced found themselves dragged into the circle. Refusal was futile. Joy was contagious. The elders sitting near the fire pretended to disapprove. They muttered about decorum, about the importance of dignity and restraint. But then the rhythm would catch them too. A foot would start tapping, a head nodding, and before long, they were clapping in time, pretending it was encouragement instead of participation. History records few moments of unanimous agreement, but this was one of them. Everyone liked the dance. The songs that accompanied it weren't about gods or kings. They were about weather, animals, food, and the mild disasters of daily life. Lyrics about spilled ale and stolen kisses, broken tools and lucky hunts. Small stories sung loudly. They didn't need meaning. They needed movement. Every voice joined, from the smallest child to the drunkest uncle, weaving noise into warmth. There was structure to the chaos. Each turn in the circle symbolized something: life, death, renewal, persistence. The steps might vary from valley to valley, but the meaning stayed the same. To dance was to remember that you existed, not as a name or a rank, but as a body capable of joy. And joy in the Middle Ages was its own quiet rebellion. When your life is bound by laws and taxes and endless sermons, laughter becomes sacred. You can picture it now, the sparks rising, the wind catching stray notes, the snow outside reflecting firelight like scattered gold. The world beyond the village might be dark and uncertain, but in this small circle, the rules of fear were suspended. Feet beat against earth, turning frost into rhythm. Hands clapped, arms swayed, the line twisted and folded back on itself. For a few hours, everything became beautifully circular. Time, movement, and meaning all chasing their own tails in perfect contentment. Somewhere in the noise, the newlyweds danced too. at first shyly, then recklessly. For once, they weren't symbols or investments, they were simply people. Two figures moving together in the same rhythm as everyone else. Not above, not below, just inside the circle. Maybe that was the real secret behind all the ceremony, to remind people that no one truly dances alone. When the song slowed, the fire dimmed, and the cold crept closer, no one wanted to stop. The final song always stretched too long, the last verse repeated again and again like a child refusing bedtime. Then, gradually, the movement faded, the circle loosened, hands unclasped. The dancers, dizzy and happy, stood catching their breath in the glow of embers. Someone laughed softly, the universal sound of enough. The air after dancing felt different, warmer despite the chill, lighter despite the smoke. Even silence seemed to hum, as if the earth itself had absorbed the rhythm and decided to keep it. For a while, nobody spoke. There was nothing to add. Words were useful for trade and argument, but joy required no translation. Later, when the guests drifted home through the dark, they carried bits of the rhythm with them, in their steps, in their humming, in the way their hearts kept time with something larger than themselves. Tomorrow they would wake to chores, debts, and cold floors. But tonight, they had been part of a circle, and the memory would keep them warm through many winters. It's funny how these rituals, meant to bless marriages, ended up blessing entire communities instead. The circle dance didn't care about status or lineage. It didn't require literacy or permission. It simply asked you to move your feet, to trust your neighbor, and to remember that joy is a kind of order too. Maybe that was the lesson hiding beneath all the noise. The world spins, and we spin with it, and that motion is what keeps everything from freezing. If you close your eyes now, you might still hear it. The echo of feet against frozen ground, the faint hum of voices carried by wind. The sound fades, but it doesn't end. It lingers like warmth trapped in the air, reminding you that people once danced just to prove the night couldn't swallow them whole. As we drift quietly onward, the fire will burn lower and the circle will close. But before the embers die, there's one more story to tell. A story of what comes after the music, when silence returns and rules resume their grip. Because the dance may end, but the need for rhythm never does. Our next step takes us to the edge of celebration, to the slow, patient laws of endings, where fire turns to ash and joy becomes memory. Every story of ambition begins the same way, with someone who refuses to stay where they're told. Harold Hardrada was that kind of man. He was born in Norway, a younger brother of a king, and therefore destined for exile. History has a sense of humour about younger brothers. They always want the throne, and they almost never get it without blood. His name, Hardrada, meant the hard ruler. It wasn't a nickname he earned later. It was more of a prophecy. You could imagine his mother sighing at the cradle, already sensing what kind of son she'd raised. He grew tall, loud, and impossible to ignore. By the time he was 15, he was fighting in wars he didn't start, for causes he didn't believe in, and losing them with admirable confidence. After one particularly disastrous battle at Stiklestad, he fled Norway, badly wounded, and set off to find work wherever swords were still in demand, which, in the 11th century, was almost everywhere. He ended up in the service of the Byzantine Empire, joining the Varangian Guard, an elite corps of northern mercenaries who protected emperors and terrified everyone else. It was a strange home for an exile, surrounded by marble, heat, and politics too complicated for translation. Still, Harold adapted. He learned to march under gold mosaics, to fight for people who prayed in Greek, and to salute emperors he couldn't understand. In return, he was paid in silver, respect, and endless opportunities to misbehave. The sagas say he fought in Sicily, crushed pirates in the Aegean, and once led a raid so successful that the emperor himself had to ask him politely to stop. Harold obeyed, eventually, and was rewarded with riches, scars, and stories that sounded slightly exaggerated even in his lifetime. By the time he left Byzantium, he was not just a soldier, he was a brand, the hard ruler, mercenary of the Mediterranean, conqueror of bad odds, promoted from exile to legend, same hours, worse meetings. He returned to Norway in 1046 with enough gold to impress anyone and enough confidence to terrify everyone. His nephew, King Magnus, wisely decided to share the throne rather than argue. The arrangement worked for about a year until Magnus died conveniently young, leaving Harold in charge of an entire kingdom. It was a remarkable transformation. The runaway boy from Stiklestad now wore a crown heavier than the wounds that had driven him from home. And to his credit, he ruled exactly as his name promised, hard. He was efficient, relentless, and occasionally unbearable. He taxed everything that moved, including fishermen, merchants, and probably hope. He reorganized the army, restructured trade, and once ordered an entire village relocated because it spoiled his view of the fjord. Yet under his iron will, Norway prospered. Ships multiplied, towns expanded, and foreign merchants learned to say his name with cautious admiration. Even his enemies admitted he had the discipline of a monk and the subtlety of a hammer. But ambition is an appetite that never stops eating. Harold began to look outward again, toward Denmark, then England. He wanted to reunite the old Viking territories under one banner, one law, one ruler. In other words, himself. It wasn't madness. It was destiny's favorite joke. The man who built order trying to outlive it. In the sagas, he is described as handsome. In the severe way mountains are handsome, tall, cold, and slightly dangerous. His armor shone like frozen sunlight, his eyes the color of steel before battle. Poets followed him everywhere, turning his victories into verse before the blood had even dried. He liked that. Kings always do. After all, history is just reputation with good editing. Still, even legends have quiet moments. Some nights, the chroniclers say, Harold would walk alone by the shore, listening to the wind. He'd spent his whole life chasing power across continents, but here, surrounded by sea and silence, he must have known how temporary it all was. The waves erased footprints faster than kingdoms erased names. You could almost imagine him smiling at the irony. The hard ruler ruled nothing he could keep. By 1066, he was over 50, an age when most men in his world were already part of history, not making it. But Harold wasn't finished. When the exiled English noble Tostig Godwinson invited him to invade England and claim its throne, he agreed almost instantly. It wasn't about wealth or even power anymore. It was about proving the universe wrong, one last time. And perhaps, somewhere deep down, it was about coming full circle, another voyage into exile, this time by choice. He gathered his fleet, hundreds of ships, thousands of men, all painted with confidence and irony. They sailed from Norway across the North Sea, their sails swollen with the same stubbornness that had carried him from Stiklestad to Byzantium. The journey was brutal, the seas colder than ambition itself. Men froze, ships vanished, yet Harold pressed on. When they reached the English coast, They came ashore singing. No one ever accused Vikings of subtlety, and for a brief, astonishing moment, it worked. At Fulford, near York, Harold Hardrada defeated the English army sent to stop him. It was his last great triumph, a reminder to the world that courage could still bend logic. He believed it was destiny finally keeping its promise. But destiny, like most allies, changes sides without warning. 3 days later, another Harold arrived. Harold Godwinson, King of England, marching north with exhausted men and unfinished prayers. The two armies met at Stamford Bridge, near a quiet river. The morning mist hid what history was about to end. But that is tomorrow's story. For tonight, imagine the hard ruler in his tent, armour polished, sword beside him, thinking that the world had finally become orderly enough to understand him. He was wrong, of course. The world never understands its last kings until they're gone. Dawn came cold and clean, as if the sky had washed itself for the occasion. Mist lay low over the river, silvering everything it touched. The grass was wet, the air sharp enough to sting. Somewhere behind that pale curtain, two armies waited for history to notice them. Harold Hardrada stood among his men, watching his breath turn white in the air, and thought, perhaps for the first time, that he might be running out of tomorrows. They had won only days, earlier, and victory makes even the tired feel invincible. His soldiers were relaxed, armour half removed, weapons stacked carelessly like firewood. They thought the fighting was done, the English beaten, the spoils waiting. They were wrong. Across the hills came another army, smaller, faster, and angry. At its head rode another Harold, the one who already called himself King of England. It's hard not to admire the symmetry. Two men named Harold, two visions of order, each convinced the world was only big enough for one of them. The English army appeared without warning, their shields catching light through the mist. The Norwegians scrambled for their gear, some didn't find it in time. Hardrada ordered them into formation, his voice cutting through chaos like a bell through smoke. He had spent his life turning disorder into discipline, and even now, surrounded and unprepared, he managed it one last time. The shield wall rose, rough, uneven, magnificent. The first clash was pure noise, steel on steel, flesh on earth, the rhythm of certainty breaking apart. Men shouted in every language known to failure. Hardrada fought in the front line, tall enough to see the horizon even in battle. His armour caught the morning sun, glowing like a small piece of destiny pretending to be metal. He swung his sword with the practiced fury of someone who'd been preparing for this all his life. For hours, the battle tilted back and forth. The English attacked uphill, the Norwegians held the bridge. A single Viking stood on that narrow span, keeping an entire army at bay. He fought until the arrows found him, and even then, the English had to send a man beneath the bridge to stab him from below. It was bravery at its most inconvenient. The bridge finally fell silent, and the river carried the news downstream. Hardrada's army began to buckle. They were too few, too far, and too tired. But he refused to retreat. For him, the field wasn't defeat, it was proof. He wanted to show the gods that he had lived exactly as promised, loudly, stubbornly, without apology. When a stray arrow struck his throat, the sagas say he laughed before he fell. You almost hope that's true. It would have been a fitting final joke. The hard ruler silenced by the world's smallest spear. Around him, the battle dissolved into confusion. The standard bearers fell, the songs stopped mid-verse, and the wind began to take over the rhythm of the day. By sunset, it was done. The English king had won, though the victory cost him dearly. 2 weeks later, he would face another invasion, this one from Normandy, and lose everything. That's how history works. One triumph always contains the seed of the next disaster. The field at Stamford Bridge grew quiet. Crows arrived first, as they always do, punctual as priests. Then came villagers, searching for the living, whispering to the dead. The river flowed calmly beside them, pretending not to notice. It's strange how nature never mourns us properly. It just keeps functioning, unbothered by our drama. When night fell, the survivors lit fires. They said little. Words felt too fragile to place beside the dead. The flames flickered on fallen shields, turning them into mirrors that no one wanted to look into. Somewhere beyond the darkness, a harp played a few uncertain notes. Not a song, just sound to remind the air that someone still breathed. In that moment, silence felt like the truest form of respect. Hardrada's body was later returned to Norway. The sagas claim that even in death, he looked majestic, a king pretending to nap. His followers buried him in the church he'd founded years before, in a land still ruled by his name and his legend. The empire he wanted never came, but the story did, and sometimes that's enough. People remember him not for what he conquered, but for the way he refused to become small. The world will always admire that kind of mistake. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear the wind over that river still. Not mournful, not cruel, just steady. It sounds like breath, or memory, or both. The bridge is gone, the army's dust, but the echo remains, drifting between the reeds. Maybe it isn't an echo at all. Maybe it's the sound of order collapsing gracefully, of rules giving way to myth. And so ends the age of the Vikings, not with conquest or glory, but with one man's quiet realization that even iron can rust. Every rule he tried to build, law, loyalty, destiny, melted in the heat of his own ambition. And yet, in that collapse, something human remained. Courage without purpose, defiance without reward, the strange beauty of trying anyway. You stand now where he once stood, the wind tugging at your sleeves, the grass cold beneath your feet. The river moves beside you, unchanged, unbothered. The sky above looks exactly as it must have that morning, wide, pale, and pretending not to judge. It's hard to say who won. History names victors, but time doesn't care. All that survives is the quiet. Somewhere far away in another century, a bell rings. It sounds nothing like a sword, and everything like a memory. The world has changed. Kingdoms gone, laws rewritten, names forgotten. But the rhythm remains. Every echo of order, every whisper of control, still follows the same pattern. Rise, rule, fall, repeat. The bell still rings, only the tower changed.